The next 45 minutes or so is really going to be an open forum conversation. We're very keen, excited to hear what all of the groups had to say. And the most important thing I want to do is to thank you for your participation. People were very engaged in the conversation. Thank you for staying, thank you for participating, and thank you for contributing your thoughts. So I've asked our co-chairs, Stephanie, Michael, Winston is not here, but he's here in spirit, of course, Barry, and Stephen, who are going to, provide their comments as part of your thinking as well. You'll know that they participated as part of the groups. Stephen has offered to, okay, the mics are back up. And so what I'm going to ask is for each of the designated group leaders to come up and give an under 3-minute overview of some of the key findings, learnings, things that they discussed. I know that doesn't sound like a lot, 3 minutes, does it? Because I'm sure that the conversation was much more robust. That's why we are really grateful that you wrote all your answers down. We've got them on our iPad, and we'll share all of that with you as well, so that you've got the information. But we want to make sure everybody gets a chance to contribute, to share their thinking, which is why we say 3 minutes, and I want to give our co-chairs a chance to respond as well. So without further ado, I'm going to ask group 1, and have we got a leader? Or has your leader disappeared? Your leader's disappeared. Do you want me to come back to that? Okay. How about group number 3, Chenille? So this is recommendation number 3, which was verify that data sources are fit for purpose, relevant, and reliable.
Thank you. So I think in general, we were saying that we're actually, quite a number of us are dismayed with the situation after listening to what's happening with data. So I think in summary, the challenge we see is that data is more fragmented in Canada than other countries. And that we need a single standardization or guidelines for, such as following CADTH, but the challenge is jurisdiction being provincially run health authorities who can set their own rules and laws, and creating more silos. And so what we think has to be addressed is, one, consolidation of jurisdiction in order to get data standardization, be cognizant of the geography, because of that in itself is a jurisdiction in itself. And then in respect to access to digital infrastructure. And then what role, so the last thing I would say is that what role can patient groups play in advancing this recommendation is possibly a data consortium, a multi-stakeholder initiative. And lastly, we said is, I want to make this point here, is about data standardization, and I would say is the standardization should come from, when it comes to data, should come from data architects. Now, I say that as a computer engineer, but what I've seen is a lot of the data standardizations are coming from MDs, PhDs, and academics versus industry that has done this before in other industries, is basically, but you don't see many data architects present in forums when we talk about health data. So I'll conclude with that.
Right. So can I just ask if there's one action your group might recommend? A data consortium?
Yes.
Would that be a fair comment?
Yes.
Okay.
What would you want? Maybe one comment just around your last point there about the engineer, the architect. I'd love your opinion on this, because one of the challenges of health data isn't, and this might be my opinion only, but it's less about the technology of data interoperability, FHIR HL7, for example. It is more about the nuances of data definition. So what does metastatic stage 4 breast cancer being to one clinician at one hospital is arguably slightly different than that definition from another clinician in another hospital, which I think might be why you see such a emphasis on having the clinician partner in the data dictionaries and the data definitions than you see the engineers. I'm in complete agreement that I think we do need the architects and engineers there, but I think the big challenge for us in health is that alignment and harmonization of the definitions. Was I supposed to ask questions or comment? I don't
No, both, actually. And there's no rules on this, Mike.
I think that's highly important. If we are going to talk about streamlining, we're going to talk about that in some of the other areas as well in terms of the recommendations. If we don't have a common set of definitions, then and what the data sets should look like from institution to institution or trial to trial, then it's hard to harmonize and utilize that data from different data banks, right? We're starting to see that in other occasions, whether it's in patient support programs or other data banks. So, and in fact, there's probably a lot of disagreement as to what should go into those databases. But one of the things in terms of embedding trials that I noted in the recommendations is try to keep it simple, right? Not to have too many data sets or data points, I guess, that would complicate the system. That was great. Thanks.
Is there a comment you wanted to make about CPIN at all? That's of value?
Not specifically
now.
about CFIN, but there is one thing I'd love to bring up as this recommendation is, and I think it pertains to Barry's point about simplifying, and the recommendation around simplifying is, as we verified the data sources, we have so many redundant data sources in our fragmented data system. Like the same data are being collected in a number of different sources. Some of those may have one or two extra variables that the other ones don't, and we see a need to create an entirely new data set, an entirely new registry, an entirely new data system within the hospital. And so I would love, as part of this, if we're doing this already, is to come out with a simplified architecture, maybe that's where you're coming from, in terms of what data are collected where, and then how do they talk to each other.
Yeah, that's the architect.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I'm going to... Sure.
So I've been very quiet. I'm Sarah Urowitz. I'm the Director for Research and Innovation at the Canadian Partnership Against Cancer. And I'm thrilled to hear this discussion about data happening here. And the one thing that I would urge the group is to align efforts. So I hope individuals in this room are aware of data work that's happening on the pan-Canadian level. So we do have the pan-Canadian Health Data Strategy, and then nested under that, Canadian Partnership Against Cancer, together with the Canadian Cancer Society, recently co-released the Pan-Canadian Cancer Data Strategy. And if you look at that strategy, the first three priorities are improving the efficiency, timeliness, and quality of data capture and access, enhancing linkages in current data, which is the second, and the third is fill gaps in current data collection and make data accessible to linkages and analysis. And I think what we're talking about here is in direct alignment with those priorities articulated in the Pan-Canadian Cancer Data Strategy, and I would encourage this group to lean on and leverage that, and to keep ears and eyes open for funding opportunities that will likely be released both through CPAC and through CCS. So I just wanted to make sure that didn't get lost in the discussion.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Appreciate that. I want to go to group number 7, which was validate the quality of the clinical trial data for research purposes.
Okay. All right, let me try to keep this to 3 minutes. All right, so the key issues and needs to Canadianizing the recommendation, I think like other people have mentioned, aligning, actually to Sarah's point, we did write this, aligning with existing initiatives like the Pan-Canadian Health Data Strategy, the Rare Disease Strategy, and the Life Sciences Strategy. So, sometimes the left hand doesn't talk to the right hand. That's really important. And validating the quality of our current data as a baseline, and then try to work backwards to see how we can make them regulatory grade. So identifying the missing data, but also a plan to collect it. And there is already existing stuff. So let's not reinvent the wheel. What Canadian landscape differences need to be considered and addressed in adopting this recommendation? We talked about how CADIS and INES have already formulated some, consensus about, what does good data look like for them. We have the FDA that has some really good kind of consensus about that, but Health Canada still doesn't, and that's really problematic. So that's, I think, something that is problematic for multi-country trials, and we can use the real-world evidence collaborative kind of definition and consensus document that was developed with the FDA and Duke Margolis guidance instead of reinventing the wheel. And obviously, something that other people have touched on is that fragmentation of data and standards across provincial and territorial health systems is really an issue. But if everybody just kind of makes it a priority, it'll be better. Then what are the key barriers to adopting the recommendation in the Canadian context? We talked about data governance models in Canada, the fragmented stewardship of data, the lack of clarity around data ownership and stewardship, the data collected in the clinical setting, and we had a really good example from someone that we'll hear about very soon. But the data collected in the clinical setting is not accessible and integrated with the research data, and vice versa, leading to fragmentation and precious time wasting for patients. And there's also a lack of follow-up even after participation in the clinical trial back into the clinical setting. So that's really a problem that should be addressed. And then finally, also in terms of budgeting and incentivizing these things, the example was that in Ontario, funding for hospital infrastructure doesn't include digital infrastructure, which is obviously necessary for what we're trying to accomplish here, unlike in Quebec and BC where it is. So there's some inequities there across provinces. What role should patient groups play in advancing this recommendation? Obviously, I have strong thoughts about this. Advocating on patient choice in knowing about clinical trials. And we had a really good example where, and we advocate for this all the time, it shouldn't be an inequity that your oncologist is not going to talk to you about other clinical trials because either he's not interested or his buddies aren't doing a trial in your disease area. It should be accessible to everyone, and patients should have the right to choose whether or not they want to participate in it, and currently doctors are making that choice for them. They're just assuming that they won't want to travel, or they're assuming that they don't want to spend out of pocket, or they're assuming that it's too risky, or that they don't want to participate. So really, don't let clinicians make decisions. Advocating for patient choice and knowing about clinical trials, don't let clinicians make decisions on what options to offer patients based on their own assumptions. And also, patients just need better access to life-saving and innovative treatments, and that's something that patient advocacy groups can continue to talk about. And then we did answer the last questions. I'll make it quick. How would you recommend that we proceed to include these new recommendations in the current Canadian city model? We were talking about throughout, we were talking about prioritizing all the things that this recommendation suggested. And we said that throughout there should be co-creation, not just consultation between clinicians and IT data scientists, but also patients. They should also be at the table co-creating what we need to do, what are the data fields, how do we make this better, how does the data actually help patients, and then prioritizing and adapting the recommendations that were suggested in terms of assessing what's missing, using data standards, which is really, really important but hard to implement, and including the clinical, patient, and IT expertise on all steps. And finally, ensuring that the clarity of roles and responsibilities, as well as the accountability to implement, is clear for everyone. I hope that was fast enough.
Thank you very much. Got
So
through
you'll
that.
have all the notes.
3 minutes. Now, that becomes difficult for these guys because you provided so many amazing comments, but Stephen's got
Where to start? Thanks.
Yeah, where to start?
Just a couple of points. I'll touch on a couple of points. First of all, maybe just as part of the understanding of this process for the report out, 3-minute report out, there's a lot, as Eva has proved, there's a lot sometimes that can be reported out in 3 minutes. All the points that are reported, of course, we're recording this, and just from a steering committee perspective, we are going to take all of these points. We're going to meet after this, and we're going to look at the calls to action and recommendations and try to connect your recommendations with the parties that can translate that into change. So thanks, Sarah, too, for your earlier comment. And alignment of the strategies, I think, is one piece, and I just wanted to speak to that. But I also think in the spirit of a learning system, taking and looking at quality as well, and the validation of that, there needs to be baked in the ability for, and an acceptance that there are going to be quality gaps, but looking and using data and the metrics around the data or the gaps, highlighting those, spotlighting those, and creating specific responses to that. So accepting that there are going to be, areas of data quality within the alignment of the data structures in the databases, we're going to be able to spot, if we design it right, where the improvements are needed, and tackle those as, rather than as a large, broad project, but from a ground-up standpoint, and look at the data, use the data to create targets. I'm an operational guy, if you don't realize that already, and develop some action plans around where there's data quality is lacking. So in that validation process, looking at building in, not just that top-down approach, but a process for how do we target and remedy where there's problems.
Okay.
I just want to add one point. So in the recommendation, it talked about including the point of view of the healthcare provider and, of course, the patient. Eva, that was great. Just thinking about something we were involved in a little while back, where the AI people were implementing some technology to collect data sets and so forth, that the healthcare provider was saying, hey, you guys are not getting the right data sets. And, and it went a little bit ballistic over the whole thing. So really underscored the necessity for the people who are working from the technical side of collecting the data do engage with the patient and, of course, the healthcare provider in order to ensure that those right data sets are collected, because that goes right to the quality of the data in the first place. So that was a lesson that I think we learned a little early on in our initiative.
Okay. Thanks, Barry. I'm going to keep things moving and ask for group number 4, which is streamline trial design to align with clinical workflows.
And thank you very much, Stephen, for reminding me that this is recorded.
No pressure.
Exactly.
It's a very friendly audience.
Especially after this great speaker prior to me. What's new to me, I've learned so many items, new set of acronyms, CT, the 3 CTNs. So I may look stupid, but CT for me was like a training class that all PI were doing for their GCP training that I was approving in my system. Mm-hmm. So this conference has been a truly high opener for me. And I feel that the industry has a long way to go. Well, I'm speaking in my small, humble experience. And I would say one, if I come back to our number 4, to streamline trial design and to align with the clinical workflow, there are challenges, and one of them is mostly Canada country. Often we have small input to the protocol design. So there would be a lot of challenge to be able to advocate. However, we can definitely try to influence and make sure we have more embedded trial. And that would go through more education and reaching out maybe the industry more. Some are leader and some maybe less advanced in the pace, and they are hesitation of changes and making sure that these type of trials get approved by the regulatory agency.
Oh, all right. Thank you very much. You looked like you were going to continue to communicate. Yes?
Well, I'm not sure. I'm sure Stephen may have some more question as we interact.
Thank you. I was just going to draw out, you represent industry sponsor, and from your perspective as a sponsor, you bring that to the table, so I appreciate that. There was a, yes, and engaged in phase 1 trials. I think just to respond to this point, something that resonated and share something that resonated with me from the talks yesterday, which was that, and I believe it was Sarah that mentioned it. I'm sorry if it was someone else. But the idea that when you're designing a trial, and I'm interested to hear maybe the sponsor's perspective on this too, which is, you know, to recognize that within standard of care, some of the measures that are sought in the study and in the visits structure or other elements can be achieved, or the measurements can be achieved through existing standard of care visits or scans that have happened that don't require an extra, sometimes costly, visit or activity dedicated for that study, for that patient, which for the patient's point of view, the all-important patient's point of view, requires another visit and a replication of effort from a system level, brings added cost and efficiency. So that's something that I just wanted to share. I guess panelists can share what
You
their ideas are.
absolutely can. I wondered, Stephanie, if you were able to comment on this, the fact that Canada oftentimes has very limited input to the trial design because of the nature of how particular industry trials are done.
This has been noted in the very many discussions over many years that we've been having at PACT, right, is the question.
Yeah.
Thank you. One sec. Oh, this is better. Yes, now, okay. My apologies. This is a conversation we've been having for a while now at PACT. You know, how does Canada have greater input into a specific industry sponsored trials? And I don't think that we have yet come up with a satisfactory solution as to how we can do this. And you know, in my previous work, when I worked in government, you know, and working with other groups that were also trying to influence what the clinical trial protocol design would look like, this was a similar sentiment. And so, I don't think that there's an easy fix to this, but greater integration, greater communication, I think, is key.
Do you see, a question for you, Nancy, do you see this discussion happening with sponsors in terms of when there's methods centers or with methods centers or with the sponsors in the protocol design stage, that there is a recognition of the ability to look at clinical workflows and leverage that in the requirements for the study and setup for the study? Is that discussion happening?
Can I add to that? Just from what I know, and again, remember, I don't know a whole lot about clinical trials, but from, like, you have to remember that when we develop a global development protocol, it is global protocol. And so one of the challenges as we look to personalize data collection for various different jurisdictions, everybody has a different set of capabilities, right? And so what is collected as routine care in Canada is totally different than what is collected as routine care in Germany, maybe not totally different as Germany, but other sites where we do have recruitment sites and we do run clinical trials. So we oftentimes develop the protocols. Again, maybe I do know quite a bit about clinical trials. When we develop these protocols, we look for these common denominators and build the systems within those protocols to say, yes, we do have to actually build infrastructure to collect this within the clinical trial enterprise versus in routine care. But it's not something that, like, it's, again, that's one of the reasons why we can't solve it overnight, but it's not unsolvable. So it's a conversation that we can have.
Thank you.
I can tell you on a global basis, you know, we're, as patient group, we're constantly consulted about how we can be more involved in the development of clinical trials. Maybe not fully the way I envision it right now, but it's definitely getting there. And I know at ESMO I had meetings with 4 pharmaceutical companies, their clinical trials people, and each and one of them were anxious to say, how can we engage more? How can we develop our protocols with your input and so forth? I do think that there's a disconnect when it, you know, so that's at the sort of the upper management, C-suite, as you call it, at the clinical trials development stage within these large companies, and then the grassroots people when the rubber hits the road, actually in the different countries. But I do hope that there's kind of a trickle-down effect where that actually will start to bring about change. But for the meantime, I'm wondering, you know, in the next year or two, our trials actually being conducted any differently than they have been in the past 20 years. I'm not so sure about that. I'm talking about the global trials, the registry trials, not necessarily the academic trials, which could be maybe more flexible in the way things are done. But I think this is where we have to start. And I did notice from your conversation, because I was at your table, that you know, that there might be, it just started to occur to me that there's a difference between if I'm speaking to global about clinical trials and what actually is happening at a phase 1 trial, you dealing with your CRO and so forth. And that's another part of the conversation that's missing. CROs are not part of this conversation, and they have to be part of the conversation since they're the ones who are actually doing the trials.
Okay.
So, great comments.
Thank you so much, everybody. I'm going to go to group 1 right now, which is recognize that embedding a trial into clinical practice is not all or nothing.
Okay, so we had a very in-depth conversation about a lot of the barriers, and my laptop won't open at this moment. So we talked about embedding clinical trials, and the suggestion was to really change the ethos of the system. You know, that's a big thing, but I think conversations like this are important. So the first thing we said was that recognition that all the paperwork and the regulations is really for the protection of the patients. But we do have an ethical issue if we start trials and we put all this money into trials and data collection, and then they don't accrue. So we've had all the patients who have the risks and the money that went into it, but no results out to help any future generations. So with that recognition, one of the things that we stated needs to be done is to engage ethics boards and institutional lawyers and groups such as that, so that the regulatory paperwork is decreased, because there's a significant burden on patients to go through a 37-page consent, the RAs who do this, the researchers who create the trials, and then the boards that are reviewing them. So we were looking to make the system more patient-centric and more patient-friendly by decreasing the regulation. And the comment was made at our table that the 37-page consent is not really created to protect the patient, but to protect the institution and the lawyers at the hospital. We wanted to see centralized reviews, kind of like OCREB, such that if you go through one regulatory body, you can have a multi-center process, and it can spread out across the country very easily, and we don't have that ability right now. We noted that there was no real engagement from the federal government here, and it's an incredible group of people that the patients have brought together to say, okay, you guys, you're all smart, figure this out, make it better for us. But we don't have engagement from the Ministry of Health, and we don't have an Ministry of Innovation and Technology here at the table. And so federal oversight and federal regulations completely missing here. We talked about the use of the EMR at the hospital to create a list of eligible patients for trials. Like, why can't the EMR say, here's a list of stage 4 lung cancer patients who are coming in today, see if they're eligible for trial. Here's all of our stage 2 breast cancer patients. And we can't do that because of regulatory issues. And we thought about philosophical statements for the hospital, like was discussed earlier, saying patients are at the center of our treatment and we want to build the future of healthcare together. You'll probably be addressed by someone about a clinical trial, and that's good. And within that, have a national marketing campaign working with patient groups to underscore the importance of having patients in research. And then finally, we talked about how we did things in COVID differently, and we've backslid. We have had the ability to have virtual consults for people who lived several hours away from a center, and we slid away from that. And it's a simple funding decision. Again, going back to the ministry and why we're making some of these decisions, and we just don't have that governmental engagement here at this meeting.
Thank you, Natalie, very much. On behalf of group number 1, is
Natalie?
there any of the comments that are made that?
Just a clarification for Natalie, if I can. You commented, it's a bit surprising for me, I'm not a clinician, so you said that there are barriers for the institution to be able to look at clinical patients that are on a given day that are presenting that might be aligned with a given trial target population. What's your barrier to being able to present the trial option? You said there were regulatory barriers to that. I was just
We
curious.
have, so for an RA to walk into the room, I have to tell the patient, the RA is going to come and talk to you about this trial. And we don't have an ability to create a list, the RAs to look through that says, these are the patients that might be of interest to you. They can look through the whole list and pick them out, but we don't have that ability.
So what's the barrier to doing that?
What is the barrier to doing that?
We're trying to get
Money.
into the solution side.
Money.
Yeah,
Institution doesn't have any money.
I think we need another conference for that, actually. Yeah.
Well, I do have so that was, thank you for those comments, that's great. One, on the solution side, something that happened recently, I was speaking to doctor at the MUHC, and how they're recruiting is as following. They're not sending in someone for a specific trial. What they're doing is when the patient is waiting for their appointment in the waiting room, going in and saying, would you be interested in participating in clinical trials? And if so, can we have your consent, to contact you for clinical trials? And that's how they began the process. And the recruitment went from minimal to pretty much fully loaded up. So there are innovative procedures, I think, that can be incorporated in order to deal with. But the topic was, it's not all. It's. I think it was. What's the not all? Not
Mission to
everything.
contact.
Yeah.
Not all or nothing. So I think that that's a sort of a minimal way that it could get started. And I could just see it in the context of Sunnybrook, having been there, that it would definitely be different in a surgical department than in the oncology department. So each probably department would have to figure out a different protocol or a different way to do it. But made sense to me, having been sitting in a lot of waiting rooms for a long time, that would be a good opportunity to speak to someone.
Thanks so much, Group 1. I'm going to ask Group 8. I want to make sure everybody has a chance to express their voice, recognize and invest in research activities. Spokesperson.
That would be me. So I come from Table 8, Group 8. We're extremely efficient, so we thought that I should wear two hats and be the lead for this. So the answer to recognize and invest in research activities was yes. Yes, period. There's a very significant conversation taking place across the country now with respect to research investment in Canada, and so many different groups are knocking on the door of the federal government, with respect to obtaining increases in research. But that's all that I'll say about that. With respect to recognizing and investing in research activities in the different clinical sites, this is what the table that I was at had to say. And the representatives, if you don't mind me saying, were from different clinical sites and also those working in research institutes. And of course, I run an organization that invests in the development of immunotherapies for the clinic. So with respect to recognizing and investing in research activities, our conversation, of course, turned to how do we make them go better? And part of this was the need to absolutely address the issues in contracting processes, in order to streamline those types of efforts. There was also a lot of discussion with respect to how can we better support investigators that are engaging in clinical research, because what some of the clinical research associates that were at my table are seeing is that depending on the doctor that a patient is assigned to, there's a very different types of options that are offered to them. And the question was why? And how do we incentivize a kind of standardization? Is it because, and this is very valid, do our doctors not have time? Probably. To engage in these types of activities, and how can we incentivize them to do that? So there was a lot of conversation about better supporting early career researchers, also providing support for clinician scientists, which is something that CIHR used to do. So definitely a re-examination of those types of programs to better support them is key. And again, we came back to, what does incentivization look like in Canada? keeping in mind that the city recommendation is from the United States. And one of the team members brought up that some of the terminology in the text was related to RVUs. We weren't sure what those were. But in Canada, when it comes to supporting researchers, those that are applying for grants aren't eligible to receive salary support. So then, what are other non-financial means of compensating and recognizing these researchers for engaging in clinical research and making this research engine go forward a little bit better? With respect to challenges, we spoke a lot about the different challenges, some of which I've already mentioned here. When we were talking about potential solutions, a great anecdote came up at our table, which related to the state of California and research universities and hospitals in that state getting together in order to coalesce and create a pool where they could bring together all of their data. And of course, it required investment. And when the argument was that this will make our clinical research go better, it of course fell on deaf ears because it's about the research. However, when the proponents turned that around and said, actually, it's going to lead to reductions in costs in the health system in the state of California, the side impact being that it would also help research advance a little bit more efficiently and would enable research. That case made it through and that funding came through. So the idea at the table when we came to the question about patient groups and what could they do was, one, harmonize what it is that they're saying with respect to a business case, where the business case is not necessarily about research, but where a side effect, if I can use that word, of whatever the business case is about will lead to an improvement in our research enterprise. And so the task that we have, or the mission that we are entrusting to patient groups, is to develop this business case and align forces between all of the different patient groups, because if I've learned one thing from advocacy to government, it is critical to all sing from the same songbook and to say the same story. So developing that business case, engaging other patient groups so that we're all singing from the same songbook, with also a clear deliverable on how it can improve research, but that is not entirely what the business case is about. It's about clearly defining positive outcomes for the healthcare system.
Thank you, Stephanie. And I'm very sorry, we're going to, I really want to hear from the last two groups, so I'm going to limit some of the comments that are made here. I'm going to ask group number 9, promote the basis for and ways to embed trial elements into clinical practice, to come up. And then we have one last group after that before we get into the final panel. I think it's very important that we hear from you and the work you've done. Who's speaking on behalf of Group 9?
Recommendation 9.
Recommendation number 9, yeah. Yeah, pardon me. Your recommendation was the same as your group.
Oh, we were group 10. Anyways, doesn't matter.
Table 10.
Yeah, I know, it's all very confusing.
Well, there's a lot of things have been said and then were touched on in our group, so I'm feeling a bit, might be a bit repetitive. But I guess the big issue around Canadianization was around data and how to deal with data silos, especially provincially, and inter-provincially and intra-provincially. And I guess we felt that the recommendation needs to be adapted so that you don't have one central data system. You have to let health systems develop their data systems. What you have to ensure is interoperability and the ability to transfer data nationally at a Canadian level. And that's what's important, not whether there's one system, 2 or 5 or 7. It's the data transfer that has to be. Another question that was also raised by another group is, where are the regulators in this discussion? They're not in the room. Seems to us they're key players. that have to be on side with embedded clinical trials. So we need to somehow get them into the discussion. We also talked about a bit of the perceptions of patients and patient groups. Clinical trials right now, I guess, are seen as, well, first of all, I should add as a piece of context, it depends on the context that patients are facing. Is it a rare disease? There's no standard of care. In those cases, patients are very well aware of the clinical trials going on and can't wait to get in. Disease areas like the one I'm in, where there's a reasonably effective standard of care, or there's an effective standard of care, clinical trials tend to be perceived as a last resort. You know, if you fail the in our case, two treatments that are standard of care, well, then you're interested in clinical trials. But when you move to embedding clinical trials in clinical practice, that kind of changes the whole. That has to change. That they have to start to be seen together, and so patient groups are going to have to start positioning clinical trials differently, and maybe to discuss clinical trials along with first-line treatment and second-line treatment on that section of the website, so to speak, as opposed to having clinical trials where they usually are, or groups where there's an existing standard of care, which is just sort of at the bottom of the page instead of at the top, so to speak. I'm doing an image here. So that was something, but it really depends on the context. And also from patients, talked a little bit about what's known in Quebec as the Desjardins incident, where there was a huge data leak. And every time you talk about sharing data, health data, that comes up. Well, you saw what happened at Desjardins. I don't want my data sold on the black market. So that there's clearly, at least in Quebec and maybe elsewhere, the patients have to come to it, or realize that it's their health, that research is eventually going to contribute to their health and their well-being and that of their family. And to see that as sharing data, as advancing health, as opposed to putting themselves at risk of a data leak. So there's some work to be done, certainly in Quebec, and I can't speak for other provinces. So
Yeah.
is that everything? Did I miss something?
Well done. Thank you.
Thank you.
In under 3 minutes. And again, I apologize that we don't have a lot of time for interaction and discussion, but I have with intention put group number 2 at the end because it was a bit loaded. Sarah was in that group, and the recommendation is assess whether clinical trial elements should be embedded into clinical practice. And again, I want to reinforce how grateful we are that the folks from City represented by Sarah have been here. They're certainly well advanced. They have a lot of wonderful information and insight to share as part of this. So we'll close on that with you, Sarah, in your group. But I think, Linda, you're the voice, is what I've understood. Oh, they're going to come together. This is perfect.
Yes. Sarah's going to answer a quick question first. RVU is relative value unit, and it's how physicians in the U.S., how they basically see how productive they are, and you'll get yelled at as a provider for them not being high enough. So you have to change that to have providers be able to participate in research or get RVUs that include research. So because if they're not high, if they take time out for research, they get in, I'm being very general here,
Thank
but
you.
that's what that means.
Totally agree.
That's, yes, thank you for that.
I think that there's Stephanie may know more about it, but just to offer some signs of hope here in Canada, there is advocacy to government on the part of professional associations, medical associations at the provincial level who are starting to recognize that they need to ensure that providers' time to invest and participate in research is actually captured and is a reportable and recognized reportable within their daily, weekly practice.
That's why that's in the recommendation.
Yeah.
Just advocating for that as well.
Healthcare Can and others are and they're actually not siloing. It's heartening for me to see that from what I've seen from outputs, and just to share to that point, it's the groups are getting together and they're starting to realize, and they're hearing from their memberships that that's an important way, similar to what Jerry was saying. I think you have to embed within their existing structures, their professional structures, their associations, ways to recognize, and also to have that as a requirement if we want to go a step further.
I think it's fantastic, right? It really speaks to Alan Forster's comment, right, about very much changing the way that we're doing business. So thank you very much for sharing that.
Perfect. And on that little point, I think, you know, one of the groups here mentioned federal government wasn't here. And may I suggest, our group didn't talk about this, another member that's not here is Accreditation Canada. In every single academic health science hospital, community hospital, 99% of healthcare institutions across the country use Accreditation Canada for accreditation. And although it's voluntary in most provinces and territories, except Quebec, it's tied to some funding sources. They accredit the research institute associated with the Academic Health Science Centre because they sit as part of the board accreditation. So if we can put standards of excellence in research for clinical trials embedded within an accreditation of an organization, it brings it to the highlight of the CEO and the executive team to have that part of their strategic plan. So it popped into my head as soon as someone said federal government. They're standalone, not for profit, NGO, but still. Our group was very, very diverse.
Just before you get started, so we usually do have someone from Health Canada here at these meetings, and we just had a last-minute cancellation. So it's definitely on our agenda to carry on post-conference.
Yeah, that's Health Canada. This is Accreditation Canada.
Yeah, no, I know, but the first part was Health Canada.
Okay,
The second
perfect.
part
Thanks, Barry.
we didn't have accreditation, but now that's on our radar.
Perfect. Thank you so much for letting me know. So a few things. We had an interesting group with diverse commentary, and I have brought the wrong sheet from my table, so maybe Sarah can start with some of it, or wait until I come back.
Well, we also talked a lot, and I don't want to repeat what other people have said, but about you know, the challenges of silos and data, and that's part of it. And part of this group of recommendations is recognizing your different types of data sources. And it was news to me that there's also some potential legal reasons you can't use. So it feels like the first thing that needs to be done is to figure that out. Like, what is the actual thing? And if you skip to the patient advocacy groups, what they can do with the groups that have lobbying arms or groups that advocate for policy change, seems like a team effort to get whatever needs to be changed. But if it doesn't need to be changed, if it's just something people are grabbing onto, that really just figuring out how to do that. And I'll share that I think your siloed healthcare systems, which we also have siloed healthcare systems, we also have payers that complicate it as well, private payers, but they've managed, sometimes what you can do while you're trying to make everybody interoperable is do systems where everybody shares their data anonymized, but it still can be tracked back to patients on the individual side, and that's what we did with Impact AFib. So that's what I would say is the solution to the barrier. We talked about that too, not just getting up here and talking about what all the barriers are, but what are the solutions is do what you can now. And if you can get groups to use the data standards, we heard yesterday that data is there, the real world data is there, and that's part of this recommendation. So yes, it should be done. Yes, it's available in the medical record, but what are the interim steps if you're waiting for these sometimes lengthy legislative changes where you could maybe find ways where people are comfortable sharing even though they keep the ownership, and you can do analysis and then you know, give it back out to the participant level. That was part of it, and I'm trying just not to say things over that other people have done. But I'll go back to group one too, the not all or nothing. So it's similar to what I just said. It's easy to get sort of bogged down in we can't do this in our system, and Sir Martin Landry from the UK always reminds us in the US, like, you can do that, and REMAC-CAP showed us that. You can do this in your massive healthcare systems, and I would say you guys can do the same thing. You can do this in your individual healthcare systems, and while you're simultaneously working on getting people to work together, but you've got big, massive healthcare systems that are, you know, millions of people, it sounds like. So you could do embedded trials within the healthcare systems and start there, and also start with that all or nothing. Which parts can you do? We heard some from the other groups of, can you do eligibility screening, and is that a rule, and why can't you get that done? And then when you find out why and it's a real problem, do that and move on to something you can do at the time. So pieces of it, I think all of our work is that. Don't just throw it out, because parts of it are hard.